Historians suggest that the ability to innovate and adapt determined whether societies could navigate periods of stress. Those that clung rigidly to old methods often fared worse than those willing to experiment with new approaches. Migration and demographic shifts also influenced decline. As conditions worsened in certain regions, populations moved in search of better opportunities. This movement placed pressure on neighboring areas and disrupted established patterns of settlement and production. In some cases, migration brought new populations into contact with established communities, creating competition for resources and altering social dynamics. These changes could destabilize existing arrangements and contribute to broader patterns of decline. Disease occasionally played a role, though its impact varied. Epidemics could reduce populations suddenly, disrupting labor forces and economic production. However, disease alone rarely caused complete collapse. More often, it acted as one stress among many, weakening societies already facing other challenges. The interaction of multiple factors made decline difficult to reverse. Environmental problems reduced agricultural output, which decreased tax revenue, which limited infrastructure maintenance, which further reduced productivity. Each problem reinforced the others in a downward cycle. Breaking such cycles required resources, coordination, and effective leadership. In societies where institutions had weakened and social trust had eroded, mobilizing collective action became extremely difficult. Communities became fragmented, focused on immediate survival rather than long-term solutions. Archaeological evidence shows that many civilizations experienced prolonged periods of decline during which urban centers shrank, monumental construction ceased, and written records became less frequent. These changes occurred gradually, sometimes over generations. People living through such declines may not have recognized the broader pattern. Each year might have seemed only slightly worse than the last. The cumulative effect only becomes clear when viewed across decades or centuries. It is important to note that decline did not mean the disappearance of people or culture. Populations often persisted, but the complex political and economic structures that had defined the civilization dissolved. People adapted to simpler, more localized forms of organization. In many cases, knowledge and cultural traditions survived in modified forms, carried forward by descendant communities or absorbed by successor societies. Decline marked the end of particular political systems, not necessarily the end of the people who had lived within them. The study of civilizational decline reveals that complexity itself can become a vulnerability. Systems that grow intricate and interdependent become fragile when faced with disruption. The same specialization and organization that create prosperity during stable periods can become liabilities when conditions change. Understanding these patterns offers perspective on how societies function and what makes them resilient or fragile. The lessons are not about specific events, but about underlying dynamics. How environmental limits, economic pressures, social structures, and institutional effectiveness interact over time. No single factor alone determines a civilization's fate. Decline results from the accumulation of many stresses, each manageable in isolation but overwhelming in combination. This gradual process, rather than sudden catastrophe, characterizes most historical examples of civilizational failure. The archaeological and historical record shows that civilizations declined when they could no longer maintain the complex systems upon which they depended. Resources became insufficient, institutions lost effectiveness, and societies fragmented under accumulated pressures. These processes unfolded slowly, often across multiple generations, making them difficult to recognize and address at the time. While uncertainty remains about specific details, in many cases, the broader pattern is clear. Civilizations fail not from single blows, but from the slow erosion of the foundations that once sustained them. Infrastructure designed for one set of conditions may become a burden when those conditions change. Extensive irrigation networks require constant maintenance. Large urban centers need reliable food supplies from surrounding countryside. Monumental architecture demands ongoing preservation. These commitments limit flexibility, making it harder to respond to new challenges. Multiple pressures rarely occur in isolation. Environmental degradation strains agriculture while economic difficulties limit resources for repairs. Administrative complexity increases costs while social divisions weaken collective action. Each problem makes others harder to address. Small challenges that might be manageable individually become overwhelming in combination. Feedback loops can amplify decline. Reduced agricultural output means less tax revenue. Lower revenue means deteriorating infrastructure. Poor infrastructure further reduces productivity. This cycle becomes difficult to break without substantial intervention, and intervention requires precisely the resources that declining societies lack. The process unfolds across lifetimes. One generation experiences minor disruptions. The next inherits slightly diminished capacity. Grandchildren face challenges their grandparents would not recognize. Eventually, systems that sustained millions cannot support the same population. Cities shrink. Trade contracts. Specialized knowledge is lost as fewer people can afford to maintain it. Populations adapt to changing conditions in various ways. Some migrate to regions with better prospects. Others shift to simpler, more self-sufficient lifestyles. Urban populations may decrease as people return to agricultural communities. These adaptations represent rational responses to changing circumstances rather than societal failure. Historical records show this pattern repeating across different regions and time periods. The specific causes vary, but the underlying dynamic remains consistent. Societies face accumulated pressures that exceed their capacity to adapt. The decline that follows is not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual unwinding of complexity. Geographic factors influence how decline manifests. Coastal societies dependent on maritime trade face different challenges than inland agricultural communities. Regions with diverse ecosystems may have more options for adaptation than those with limited environmental variety. Climate conditions affect the severity of agricultural stress. The pace of decline varies considerably. Some societies experienced rapid contraction over a few generations. Others declined gradually across centuries. Research suggests that the speed of decline often relates to how interconnected and specialized a society had become. More complex systems can unravel more quickly when critical components fail. Understanding these patterns does not mean civilizations are doomed to fail. It reveals instead that maintaining complex societies requires continuous effort and adaptation. Systems that appear solid may harbor hidden stresses. Success in one era creates conditions that later generations must navigate. Many questions remain unanswered. Historians continue debating which factors mattered most in specific cases. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses but rarely complete pictures. The interactions between environmental, economic, social, and political forces are difficult to untangle even with modern analytical tools. New research methods continue revealing details about past societies. Soil analysis, climate reconstruction, and advanced dating techniques provide information unavailable to earlier scholars. Each discovery refines understanding, though certainty about events from centuries or millennia ago remains elusive. What becomes clear from examining these historical patterns is that civilizational decline results from accumulated pressures rather than single catastrophic events. The process unfolds slowly, shaped by choices made across generations and circumstances beyond any individual's control. Societies that seem permanent prove vulnerable to stresses that compounded over time, eventually overwhelming the systems that once sustained them.